Our gaze interaction triggered cuts were inspired by a few other VR short films we had researched that utilize gaze detection within the experience, such as Chris Melk's Sightline the Chair. However, while the central conceit for Melk's experience was that your environment changed based upon where you were not looking, we decided instead to try and invert this mechanic and design a cut that was triggered by what the guest was directly focusing on instead. We wanted to try and make a few cuts and transitions that would afford guests a greater degree of agency over the cut itself, since we felt that VR gave us the opportunity to make guests a more active participant in the experience, and thus the editing itself. As a result, we designed our gaze interaction triggered cuts such that the transition itself is triggered upon whether or not the guest is looking at a particular object in their hand. We wanted the trigger for these cuts to be based on the information of whether a person's gaze is entering or exiting the target object, and so we developed a tool to help detect what we've termed guest's attention. The tool itself is built around Unity's raycasting system. The script is attached to the main camera in the scene, and the ray is generated from the center eye anchor. From this ray, we defined a range of interactivity such that when the guest picks up an object and moves it within this range, the transition is triggered. We believe that, due to the greater sense of being in VR experiences, that guests would interact with the environment in ways that mirrored their actions in real life. So because people generally look at the objects they pick up in the real world, we naturally assumed that this would extend into VR. However, we wanted to test these assumptions to refine this transition into something usable for the VR format. To do so, we mocked up an environment inspired by Marcel Proust's famous Madeleine moment, creating two different dining table environments to establish a distinct before and after. We next tested a few different parameters. How long do guests usually gaze at an object? Do guests actually look at their hands when they pick up an object? And if not, would it be better to cue the transition off of the action of grabbing the object instead, meaning that the gaze as a mechanic was not as effective as we hoped it would be? Is it more natural to cue the transition after the guest looks away from the object, meaning that the guest must first pick up an object, look at it, and then look at the environment? Or can we cue the transition after some fixed amount of time when the guest looks at the object in their hand? And lastly, is it jarring for the actual cut itself to be a jump cut, or would a dissolve work better? Upon both our own internal playtesting and playtesting with people from outside the project, we made the following determinations. We quickly discovered that people's gaze times wildly diverged, and that there was no true mean gaze time. Some guests never looked away from the object at all. Not only do guests look at their hands when they pick up an object, but they also spend so much time staring at the object that they often didn't notice that the environment changes, unless the changes happen to small details directly in front of them. Triggering a transition off of when they were not looking at the objects proved difficult, because this hardly ever happened or happened too fast, as guests were content with playing with and staring at whatever it was that they were holding. So setting a fixed time of around 2 seconds for the transition to occur seemed to work best relative to our other parameters. From our playtesting sessions, there was only a slight preference for dissolves over a traditional jump cut. And finally, we didn't expect that people would actually want to interact with the object, such as throw it across the room or bring it up to their face to try and eat it within the experience. So in summary, here are a few major things we learned about executing this transition properly. Gaze interaction trigger cuts that are based off of holding an object in your hand need to have very obvious environmental changes in order for guests to perceive a cut, and should trigger about 2 seconds after the guest looks at the object. Gaze interaction trigger cuts that are based off of looking at objects in the environment need some kind of indirect control to motivate their usage, that you can cue these instantaneously. Finally, softer cuts are favored over harder jump cuts. Feel free to play around with these cuts yourself in our cutting-edge VR transition tool on GitHub, link in the description below.